It was a quiet late afternoon, and the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long golden shadows over the small suburban gas station. The air had a soft, almost surreal stillness to it, as though the world had momentarily paused to take a breath. There were only a handful of cars scattered around the station, each one parked at its designated pump, the quiet hum of the fuel dispensers the only sound breaking the silence. A dark blue sedan pulled into the station, its tires rolling smoothly over the asphalt. The car was unremarkable at first glance. Just another vehicle among many, nothing to catch the eye. But as the car came to a stop near an empty pump, a subtle energy filled the space, a sense of calm authority that contrasted with the usual rush and impatience often associated with a gas station. The driver was a black woman, perhaps in her mid-30s, with a presence that seemed to draw attention without even trying. Her name was Maria. Her long dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and she wore a simple t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers. Nothing that would suggest she was anything other than an ordinary person running a mundane errand. But there was something about the way she carried herself, her stillness, her slow, deliberate movements, that hinted at a depth beyond what her appearance let on. Maria stepped out of her car and walked toward the fuel pump, her gaze steady, calm, almost like she was simply part of the scenery. She wasn't in a rush. She didn't seem to care for anyone or anything around her. There was no frantic search for her wallet or fumbling with the gas nozzle, just a quiet routine. She inserted the pump into her car's tank, waiting patiently as the fuel began to flow. Inside the small convenience store, the door chimed as it opened, and Officer Mark, a young cop in his late 20s, walked in. His uniform was sharp, almost military in its precision. His face was set in a neutral expression, but there was a look in his eyes, one of self-assurance, maybe even a little arrogance. He had the air of someone who was used to giving orders, not receiving them, someone who was certain that his position of authority would keep him in control of any situation. His every step seemed to radiate confidence, maybe a little too much. He approached the counter to buy a coffee, his attention distracted for just a moment by the woman outside. Maria was now finishing up at the pump, and the officer's eyes couldn't help but linger on her as she returned the nozzle to its place with a simple, graceful motion. There was something about the way she moved. It was almost too composed, too calm for an ordinary person. "Not many people stop here this late," he muttered to himself, casually glancing back at her, taking in the car she was driving. It was a sedan, nondescript, nothing special, but for some reason he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out of place. He shrugged it off and made his way to the door, coffee in hand. As he stepped out of the store, the late afternoon sun cast a soft glow over the gas station. Maria was finishing up, the pump clicking off as she finished fueling her car. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary, before stepping up, his voice cutting through the calm evening air. "You don't look like you belong here," he said, his tone laced with a mix of curiosity and condescension. He leaned slightly against his patrol car, watching her closely. Maria didn't respond immediately. She simply turned her head slightly to acknowledge him, then gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Her eyes were steady, calm, but there was a sharpness to them that made Officer Mark hesitate for a brief second. She had yet to say a word, but somehow his confidence faltered. The rumble of Officer Mark's patrol car echoed in the otherwise quiet station as he rolled in, his headlights briefly casting long shadows across the empty lot. It was a slow afternoon, and the atmosphere still hung with the easy calm of the fading daylight. He pulled the car to a stop near the front of the station, parking just a few spots away from Maria's sedan. It was routine, just another stop while patrolling the area. He wasn't expecting anything interesting to happen. It was supposed to be just another uneventful shift. As he stepped out of the car, he glanced around, scanning the lot. Nothing seemed out of place, just the usual scene. A few parked cars, a handful of customers filling up or grabbing snacks from the small convenience store. He stretched briefly, then took in the sight of Maria, who was standing at her car, finishing up with the gas pump. At first, there was nothing particularly special about her. She looked like any other woman running errands on a lazy afternoon. Her casual t-shirt, worn jeans, and sneakers were standard fare. Nothing about her screamed trouble or intrigue. He barely gave her a second thought as he made his way towards the store. But then, something about the way she held herself caught his attention. There was a certain stillness to her, the kind of quiet confidence that to him felt almost out of place in a place like this. Most people at gas stations were a little more rushed, a little more frantic. But Maria? She was calm. Too calm. His eyes narrowed for a moment as he adjusted his belt, then made his way to the door of the store, not yet thinking much of it. But, as he stood in line, grabbing his coffee and glancing out the window toward Maria, something started to nag at him. His eyes moved from her car to her attire, and then to the surrounding area. This was a part of town he'd seen mostly after dark, when the streets were quieter, and the types of people who lingered in places like this weren't always the most upstanding. As a cop, he'd gotten used to picking up on subtle cues. People's behavior, the way they dressed, the way they spoke, and something about Maria just didn't match what he thought belonged here. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it felt off. So, without thinking too much about it, Officer Mark decided to make his move. He paid for his coffee, then stepped outside, his boots tapping lightly against the pavement. His eyes found Maria immediately, standing next to her car, her focus entirely on the task of returning the fuel nozzle to the pump. With a slow, deliberate pace, he approached her, hands tucked casually into the pockets of his uniform, his expression flat but watchful. "You don't really look like the type to be around here, do you?" he said, his voice cool and controlled. His words weren't aggressive at first, just a thinly veiled observation, the kind a cop might make to engage with a stranger. Maria didn't look up immediately. She continued to place the nozzle back in its holder, her movements measured, precise. It was almost like she hadn't even noticed him. But he didn't take it as a sign to back off. Instead, he pressed on, his tone sharpening ever so slightly, as if he were trying to provoke a reaction from her. "You know, it's not really a good idea to be out here at this hour, especially with, people like you." He let the words hang for a moment, his gaze narrowing, as if he were inspecting her, waiting for some kind of response. This time, Maria paused. Her fingers tightened on the nozzle for just a second longer than necessary before she straightened up. The only indication that his comment had landed was the subtle shift in the air, the slightest tension forming around her. She turned to face him, but not with the aggression he expected. No, her look was calm, almost measured, her eyes cool as she met his. But Officer Mark wasn't done yet. "I mean, people like you don't really fit in around here, you know?" His voice was now tinged with something harsher, a sharp edge creeping in. "Maybe you should be careful. Wouldn't want to get mixed up with the wrong crowd." There it was. The insult. Subtle, but unmistakable. It wasn't just about her presence here anymore. It was about him questioning her right to be here, her worth, based purely on nothing more than the way she looked. Maria didn't flinch. Instead, she held his gaze, her expression neutral. It was a stark contrast to his posture, which was now leaning against the patrol car as if he had all the time in the world to wait for her to react. But Maria didn't give him the satisfaction. She took a slow breath, her posture still composed. She could feel the thin thread of tension growing between them, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word. Officer Mark, however, wasn't backing down. He took a step closer, perhaps sensing her calm as a challenge. He was used to control, used to seeing people react to his authority. But Maria, she was different. She wasn't rattled, and that made him uncomfortable. "I'm just saying, maybe you're out of place. Maybe you shouldn't be out here after dark, especially with your type of attitude." His words were laced with the kind of condescension that made the air feel suddenly heavy. Maria could feel the subtle insult now, the underlying racism in his words. But she didn't react. Not right away. She knew what he was trying to do: provoke her, get her to lose her composure. Instead, she remained calm, taking her time as she retrieved her wallet from her bag. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence, her collectedness, was enough to make Officer Mark's unease grow. "You know, you really shouldn't judge people like that," Maria said finally, her voice quiet but firm. There was no anger in her tone, just a certain stillness that held far more power than any heated response ever could. The officer's lips curled slightly as he tilted his head, almost amused. "Oh, really? And why is that?" Maria simply returned his stare with a calm, steady gaze that made him feel a little more uncertain with every passing second. "Because I'm not the person you think I am." There was no trace of fear in her voice, only the quiet confidence of someone who had seen and endured much more than a petty, dismissive cop's assumptions. He could feel the air around them shift, but instead of retreating, he stood his ground. The tension hung there, thick and uncomfortable, but Maria wasn't about to let it overwhelm her. Her gaze softened ever so slightly, but it was still unwavering. It was clear. She wasn't here to argue. She was here to teach him something, whether he was ready to learn it or not. Part 3. The Revelation, the Twist. Expanded version. The tension between Officer Mark and Maria was thick, palpable, almost suffocating. Officer Mark stood there, a slight smirk still playing on his lips, his eyes gleaming with the arrogance of someone who thought he was in control of every situation. Meanwhile, Maria's silence weighed heavy on him. He couldn't understand why she wasn't reacting. Most people would be angry, defensive, or confrontational by now, yet Maria remained calm, composed. It was almost as though she was waiting for him to trip over his own assumptions. He took another step closer, wanting to press his advantage, to see if he could get under her skin. The words seemed to spill out of him before he could stop them. His gaze flicked down to her car, and then back to her, as if he were dissecting her every move, trying to justify his behavior. "You know, I see a lot of people come through here, but you don't exactly fit in with the rest of them." The words came out with that same dismissive, almost condescending tone he hadn't been able to shake off. "Just don't want you getting caught up in the wrong crowd." Maria didn't react, not even a twitch of an eyebrow. He was getting frustrated now, the awkward tension building, but he couldn't let go. He had to be right. She had to be wrong. He glanced around at the small, mostly empty gas station, as though searching for support, but there was no one else to back him up. The world seemed eerily still, as if everything was holding its breath. Maria's calmness was unsettling. It made him question everything, his instinct to label, his quickness to judge. Why wasn't she getting upset? Why wasn't she getting defensive like all the others? She exhaled slowly, her eyes meeting his for a split second before she returned her attention to her car, where she was organizing her belongings. His words hung in the air like a weight, but she didn't take the bait. There was a quiet pause, and then something shifted. Just for a moment, it was as if the world around them held its breath. Maria finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but there was a firmness to it, something in the way she said the words that made it clear this wasn't the first time she'd been forced to defend herself, but she wasn't angry. She was just matter of fact. "It's funny you say that," she began, her voice almost too calm, "because I thought we were beyond making judgments based on people's appearances." She wasn't looking at him, her gaze still fixed on her car, but there was a quiet power in her words that made Officer Mark take a step back. The unspoken challenge was there, hanging between them, just out of reach. For a moment, Officer Mark didn't understand. He was about to make another remark, something to brush off her comment, but then, for some reason, something inside him made him pause. Something about her tone, the way she had spoken with such composure and clarity, made him realize this wasn't going to be an easy confrontation. Before he could say another word, Maria reached into her bag, her movements slow, deliberate. Her fingers brushed against a small leather holder. Officer Mark watched closely, but didn't think much of it at first. Was she pulling out a phone? A wallet? Maybe a note to write something down? He wasn't sure, but he was prepared to dismiss it. But then, she pulled out something unexpected, a federal agent badge, sleek and polished with a symbol Mark instantly recognized. His eyes widened. For a moment he was utterly still. Everything else around him seemed to blur, and all he could focus on was the badge, gleaming in the dimming light. His smug expression faltered, his shoulders stiffening, as the weight of the situation began to dawn on him. Maria held the badge up slowly, letting it catch the light. Her fingers didn't tremble. There was no smug satisfaction in her eyes, no "I told you so" look. It was as though she had simply presented a fact, something that didn't need to be explained, just acknowledged. The badge was the key to everything. The moment the metal caught the fading sunlight, Officer Mark's arrogance began to slip away. The world seemed to tilt ever so slightly, shifting in a way he couldn't control. For a few seconds, he didn't know what to say. He stared at the badge, unable to fully process what had just happened. His mind was whirring, trying to make sense of it. His first instinct was to deny it, to brush it off as some mistake. But everything about her, the calm, the authority, the way she'd held herself, began to make sense now, in a way it hadn't before. Maria lowered the badge and finally met his eyes once more. There was no anger there, no malice, just a quiet disappointment. "I'm a federal agent," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You might want to reconsider your assumptions about people next time." The words hung in the air like a quiet storm, and Officer Mark felt them wash over him. "Federal agent!" The words still hadn't quite settled in his mind, like something that should have been obvious but wasn't until it was too late. 1,000 thoughts raced through his head in a heartbeat, each one contradicting the last. How could he have missed the signs? How had he let his biases cloud his judgment so completely? He wanted to speak, to apologize, but no words seemed to come out. It wasn't just that he had been wrong about her. It was the crushing realization that his entire mindset, the assumptions, the quick judgments he made based on superficial details, had been completely misplaced. His entire view of the world had been shaken in that moment, not just because of who Maria was, but because of who he had been up until now. For the first time in his life, Officer Mark felt what it was like to be on the other side of judgment. He had assumed he knew everything about her, about anyone he encountered, really. But now he knew nothing. The moment Maria had revealed who she was, the ground beneath him had shifted, and he was left standing there, stunned by his own ignorance. Maria didn't wait for a response. She simply turned away, her back to him now as she walked toward her car. There was no dramatic speech, no fiery rebuke. There didn't need to be. The lesson had been taught, and it wasn't lost on Officer Mark. It wasn't about making him feel guilty. It was about making him understand. She reached her car, paused for a second and looked back at him. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no gloating. She simply offered one last piece of wisdom, something that carried more weight than any apology or explanation could. "Maybe next time you'll think before you speak." And with that, she was gone. The car door clicked shut, the engine hummed to life, and she pulled out of the lot without looking back. Officer Mark stood frozen, watching as she drove away, the words still echoing in his mind. He felt small now, not because of her, but because of his own actions, his assumptions, his judgments. He was no longer the confident officer who could see everything with certainty. Now he was just a man who had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, and that every person deserved respect, regardless of how they looked, what they drove, or where they came from. As her taillights faded into the distance, Officer Mark was left standing there, empty-handed, with only his thoughts and the profound realization that his quick assumptions about Maria had cost him more than he was willing to admit. The moment hung between them like a suspended breath. Officer Mark stood frozen, his eyes locked on the shiny federal agent badge Maria had just revealed. His pulse quickened as the weight of the situation settled in. He had spent the last few minutes assuming he had control, assuming he was the one holding all the cards. But now, standing in front of him, was someone far more powerful than he could have imagined. Someone who had quietly allowed him to make assumptions, to pass judgment on her without her saying a word. At first he couldn't speak. His lips parted as if trying to form words, but nothing came out. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he felt like he was suffocating in his own skin. This wasn't just any mistake. This was the kind of misjudgment that threatened to shatter his entire sense of self-assurance. He had been wrong. Not just a little wrong, he had been profoundly wrong. His assumptions, his arrogance, and the ease with which he had dismissed Maria. It all came crashing down on him now. The shock of seeing her badge, the realization that he had insulted a federal agent, was too much to process in the span of a few seconds. Maria remained silent, watching him with quiet, steady eyes. She didn't need to say anything. The badge had already done the talking for her, but still, Officer Mark struggled to find his voice, to find something, anything, that might undo the damage he had just done. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he managed to speak, though his words came out slow, almost hesitant. I'm sorry." He shifted uncomfortably, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. It wasn't just a forced apology. It was the kind of apology that came from somewhere deep within him, a place he didn't often access, a place where his pride and arrogance didn't reign. Maria didn't react at first. She simply stood there, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. Officer Mark continued to fumble, his voice growing more awkward as the seconds stretched into an unbearable silence. I didn't know who you were. He trailed off, his words suddenly sounding empty. How could he possibly explain the way he had treated her? How could words make up for the assumptions, the judgment, the disrespect? The silence between them felt heavy, thick with the weight of his regret. Maria's eyes softened, but there was no anger in them, no resentment, just a quiet, almost sad understanding. She could see the way his confidence had crumbled, the way his facade was beginning to break apart. She didn't say anything to interrupt his stammering apology. Instead, she simply allowed him to feel the full force of what he had done. After a few more moments, Maria took a step forward, closing the distance between them just a little. She was close enough now for her words to land with precision, and yet she spoke with the calm of someone who had been in situations like this before. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't berate him. She didn't react with anger. Instead, her voice was low, steady, and surprisingly gentle. You see, officer, she began, her tone still firm but measured. "You can't judge someone based on how they look or where they're from." Her gaze never wavered from his, holding him with the kind of steady certainty that demanded respect. "People are more than their appearances or the assumptions you make about them." She paused, letting her words hang in the air for a moment, allowing him time to absorb their weight. The silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was more like a soft invitation, an opportunity for him to reflect on his actions, to learn from them. Officer Mark shifted uncomfortably again, his face flushed with embarrassment, the color creeping up his neck and settling in his cheeks. His eyes darted away from hers, his gaze falling to the pavement beneath his boots, as though the ground might open up and swallow him whole. For the first time, he felt small, really small. Not in the way he was used to, where his uniform gave him power and made people defer to him. No, this was different. This was the kind of smallness that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. He wasn't a cop in this moment. He was just a man who had been completely exposed for his ignorance, his arrogance, and his unwarranted assumptions. Maria's words had hit him harder than he was ready to admit. They weren't harsh, but they were undeniable. They had come with a quiet strength, a wisdom he had failed to recognize in her, simply because he had been too caught up in his own perception of who she was. He felt something shift inside of him, something uncomfortable, but necessary. A realization began to take root in the pit of his stomach. He had just been given an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to truly understand something he had taken for granted his entire career. Maria wasn't some ordinary woman. She wasn't just the kind of person who could be written off because of her clothes or her demeanor. She wasn't defined by the assumptions he had made about her based on her appearance. And more importantly, she wasn't here to tear him down or make him feel worse about himself. She was simply offering him the chance to open his eyes, to see beyond his narrow perspective. And that, in its own way, felt like a gift. He stood there for a long moment, his mouth dry, the apology still hanging between them. He wanted to say something more, something that would fix this. But he knew there was nothing that could undo what had been said. The only thing left was to learn from it. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Officer Mark took a breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You're right." The words were simple, but they carried an earnestness that he didn't often show. I'll do better." Maria gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. There was no smile, no sign of triumph, just the quiet acknowledgement of a lesson learned, a moment of growth. "I hope you do, officer," she said softly, her tone still steady, but with a subtle warmth behind it. "It's not too late to change." With that, Maria turned toward her car, her steps unhurried. Officer Mark watched her for a moment, his chest heavy with the weight of his realization. The sun was almost gone now, the light fading into the horizon, and with it, the final echoes of his arrogance. For the first time, Officer Mark felt like he had been truly humbled, and perhaps, for the first time, he was ready to take that lesson forward with him. The soft chime of the gas station door echoed through the air as Maria finished her transaction at the counter. She paid without fanfare, her movements deliberate and composed. There was no need to hurry, no rush to escape the scene. Her presence here had already made an impact. She had said what needed to be said, and the lesson, in its quiet way, had been delivered. Maria tucked her wallet back into her bag and made her way to the door. Her footsteps were calm, unhurried, as if this were just another stop in her day. But for Officer Mark, this moment felt like the closing of a chapter he wasn't quite ready to end. He stood just inside the convenience store, watching her every move, still processing everything that had just unfolded. There were no more words, No more excuses, just the weight of his own reflection and the regret that slowly but surely was sinking in. Maria stepped outside into the cooling evening air, her car still parked in the same spot. She didn't glance back as she approached it, not until she was almost there. At the last second, just as her hand reached the door handle, she paused. She turned her head over her shoulder, just enough to catch Officer Mark's gaze one last time. There was no anger in her eyes now, no bitterness, only the quiet strength that had carried her through every moment of this encounter. Her voice was soft but firm when she spoke, a final piece of wisdom, unhurried and deliberate. Maybe next time you'll think before you speak. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a scolding. It was simply a statement. A reminder that assumptions, once made, were hard to take back. That sometimes the words we say to others linger longer than we think. With that, Maria opened the door to her car and slid inside. The engine hummed to life as she pulled away from the gas station, the headlights cutting through the dimming light. The patrol car sat silently behind her, the contrast between their vehicles a stark reminder of the different paths they were on. She didn't look back as she drove away, her car disappearing down the road into the growing dusk. But Officer Mark did. For several long moments, he just stood there, watching the taillights of her sedan fade into the horizon. His eyes remained fixed on the road long after the car had disappeared from view. The sound of the passing traffic, the distant hum of the streetlights, all seemed muffled, as if the world around him had gone quiet. In the stillness of that moment, he felt something that hadn't been there before, something heavy, yet strangely enlightening: regret. His mind replayed everything, the assumptions he had made about her, the way he had judged her without knowing a single thing about her. He had thought he was in control, thought he understood who she was, simply based on the color of her skin, her clothes, the way she held herself. He had been wrong, completely wrong. He stood there for another long moment, the weight of his mistakes sitting heavily on his shoulders. His mind raced back to Maria's final words. Maybe next time, you'll think before you speak. The truth of her statement hit him like a cold wave. Next time. It was a reminder to slow down, to stop assuming that he could understand people based on the surface, to question his own biases, his own snap judgments, to really listen and see the person standing in front of him. Officer Mark stood there for a while longer, lost in thought, his gaze still fixed on the now empty road where Maria had disappeared. The confidence that had once defined him, that sharp, arrogant edge he had worn like armor, seemed so distant now. Instead, he felt human, vulnerable. He wasn't some figure of authority in that moment. He was just a man, standing alone, reflecting on how easy it had been to be wrong, and how hard it had become to face that truth. As the camera zoomed in on Officer Mark's face, his expression was one of regret, a mix of realization and the painful understanding that his actions, no matter how small or seemingly harmless at the time, had consequences. The camera held on him for a beat longer, capturing the shift in his demeanor. The man who had walked into this gas station filled with self-assurance, authority, and judgment was now standing there, completely deflated. The arrogance that had once been his shield was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. The voiceover, soft and reflective, carried the moral of the story. Judging people based on their appearance or background can lead to regret. You never know who someone truly is, and every person deserves respect, no matter how they seem on the outside. The scene faded out, the sound of a distant siren echoing in the background, symbolizing the larger lessons to be learned. The camera lingered for a final moment on the empty gas station, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground, marking the end of the day and the beginning of a new perspective for Officer Mark.